Hello everyone, and welcome to Character Gallery. I'm one of your hosts, MasterOfTheLemons, aka Lemmy.
And I'm HiroTheJapaneseTrain, aka Matt.
And today, we've got a very, very obscure character to talk about, which I think the more obscure these characters get, the more fun this is, because I think the less information we have, the more we're able to come up with ourselves and to extrapolate from what very little we have to go off of. And I think I can't think of a more obscure character than 13, which is, if you don't know who 13 is, he's this one magazine character that appeared in a single magazine story. We've only got a single illustration of him. And we do have a synopsis of his story on the wiki, but we don't have the original magazine story. So, I haven't read the original story to know for sure if the wiki is accurate or not. Me and Matt have decided we're just going to go with what the wiki says and...
Yeah, because otherwise that would entail us having a copy of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends 273 published on April 1st, 1998, and unfortunately we can't have everything we want in this world.
No, we can't.
And, but we decided to do 13 also because this is our 13th episode. So 13, I'll just go ahead and read his biography. 13 was a spare engine from the mainland and was brought to help Donald and Douglas, who were feeling overworked. When he first arrived, he proved to be very unlucky. He caused delays for Donald and Douglas, got hit by a landslide, just throw that in there, and then damaged his firebox, which got knocked out of place. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Sir Topham had sent him to the works, and Donald and Douglas thought that would be the end of him. That can mean many things.
Jeez. That's so intense. We both read through this earlier, and it's just see that right there, I'm a little bit skeptical about, I worry that when this has been transcribed onto the wiki, there's a little bit of ambiguity, because this isn't the original text.
Yeah, that could mean 13 being scrapped, that could mean him being sent away, they're just wiping their hands clean of him,
Yeah, it's really unsure as to what that truly means.
Yeah.
And let me read the second part. However, after the repairs, he came back to Sodor with a bigger firebox and a proper cab, which cured his unluckiness. He told Donald and Douglas that he came to Sodor as a very unlucky engine, but returned to the mainland as a very lucky one. It is unknown what happened to him afterwards, okay? It's a little unsettling.
His whereabouts are unknown.
So,
right off the bat, I think that it's interesting that, this was something I was thinking about just beforehand, is that this story seems to suggest that because he is number 13, because that is his name, there's kind of a judging a book by its cover thing, where they're sort of oh, it's 13, of course he's unlucky, but then, the repairs were all he needed. It's not because of his name,
yeah.
It's because of a faulty firebox.
That's interesting that his name doesn't change by the end of it. That, he apparently just keeps it.
But people just assume that he's a jinx because he's just 13.
Yeah, they're just misinterpreting the accident he gets into. It's, I have to wonder, so Donald and Douglas are very heavily involved in this story.
Yeah.
I do find it kind of cool that, I know a lot of people bring this up, but, when Wilbert comes to Sodor, and he takes, he's kind of there to help Donald and Douglas because they're so, busy during the busy season. And then Wilbert leaves. It's said that the Fat Controller wants to bring another austerity tank engine to Sodor to help Donald and Douglas and kind of alleviate that workload.
There's nothing that says that he actually gets an austerity, much in the same way that he expected an Atlantic and got Henry.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I think what you're implying is that 13 fills the gap there.
Yeah, so that would be interesting, as if 13 arrives in the 90s, but at the same time, it says 13 was a spare engine from the mainland.
That's the thing.
That doesn't sound like he's coming from a heritage railway. That sounds like he's coming from BR.
I envisioned this in the BR era.
Me too.
I think it's partially the black livery,
Yeah, he looks very much like he's in some sort of BR lined black type of thing.
I could see 13 coming over, during, let's say it's the 50s, early 60s. it'd be before 64, 65, I think. So he comes to the mainland to help Donald and Douglas, and of course Donald and Douglas are, relatively new to the island at this point. Donald and Douglas, of course, would be very skittish about an engine coming over from the mainland, and they'd be kind of thinking, wait a minute, he's going to go back. Like, they see him messing up and everything, and clearly being inefficient, and they're like...
Yeah, that's true. I'd love to see that story, because it would be essentially 13 arrives, and he's just this really unlucky engine, and he's trying his best, but just not succeeding at all. And Donald and Douglas would take all these steps to kind of obfuscate all the problems that he has and all the things that he's doing wrong, because they really don't want the Fat Controller to find out that this engine is screwing up. Because that's, if anyone on the island to encounter an unlucky engine during the BR era, 13 could not have had better luck, really, than Donald and Douglas, the two engines who know the dangers of dieselization and the dangers of being sent to the mainland and scrapped better than anybody else.
And, the ignorance of some of the other engines would be downright dangerous. I think if 13 was, spent all of his time around Thomas or Gordon, they wouldn't think anything of it. He'd be more annoying to them, and they wouldn't be thinking about, his life or death circumstances.
Yeah, because if we're talking like early 60s here, say if this is in 1961, this is after Donald and Douglas have run away from scrap to save their own lives, but it's before the rest of the engines are kind of getting the full... It's even before Stepney arrives, and it's even before Bluebells of England, where, the engines all have this meeting with the Fat Controller, and he explains to everybody that dieselization is happening.
Yeah.
This is before they really understand the full magnitude of this.
Yeah, they're one of the few engines.
They're the only two engines on the island that really fully get how much trouble 13 is in. And then they'd try to tell the other engines, and, maybe 13 would, bump into James with, a coal truck, and it would break, and coal would go all over him. And he'd just be like, "You little twit! How dare you! I'm telling the Fat Controller!" And Donald and Douglas would have to pull him aside and be like, "No, James, you can't do that." And James is like, "Well, why the hell not?" And it's like, "Because he's in serious trouble. You know where he's going to go back if the Fat Controller sends him away." It'll take a lot of convincing to make him not tell the Fat Controller, because James would be like, "He's gonna be fine over there, calm down." And because we're not to the point where engines are starting to really, really disappear yet, and so the engines
especially because he's a little tank engine.
Yeah,
he doesn't have the privilege of being this big goods engine or an express engine.
He's very much, he's dispensable.
Yeah.
And he's probably pretty old, too. Around the area of Barrow-in-Furness, there are a lot of really old, late 1800s, early 1900s tank engines that all would have been painted black, very much like 13 in that general area.
Yeah.
In the main sheds at Barrow-in-Furness, a lot of those engines were little tank engines.
Yeah.
They stored something like 30, 40 engines in one shed. I mean, there were a lot. And so, they were very... It wouldn't be a big deal if they got rid of one. And 13 might be one of those engines. I kind of imagine that... I think that even though the landslide is kind of what knocks his firebox loose, apparently, I think that he's probably had trouble from the beginning. I mean, just look at him. He's clearly not an existing class. He's clearly a very unusual design. I think that he was probably designed by an independent workshop in the late 1800s, and he's been passed around his whole life, and they've probably done, 7 different railways have probably done, dozens, hundreds of different modifications on him, trying to make him work, and he's always been this kind of just nuisance that they're trying to fix, but they can't really do effectively.
And he always manages to survive by the skin of his teeth, being just useful enough not to just get rid of entirely. And I think the Fat Controller probably picked up on that when he had 13 come over. Honestly, you brought up the 8 famous engines. That's 1956.
Yeah.
When the events of that take place. I guess it's a bit earlier in the timeline, but it's still roughly within the same 5 to 7 year period. He could very well have been one of those engines and then just stayed.
That's also possible, yeah.
I could see that happening. One of Percy's friends. What if Percy, 13 comes over and, he's one of those engines around the turntable with Percy. And
that would be great.
He befriends 13, so,
this is all coming together, is that, because Percy has this kind of, Donald and Douglas are kind of like Percy's fun uncles, they're and they're always kind of looking out for him, and sometimes they're a little bit annoyed by him, but usually they're I think of that scene in what's the Percy in the Old Mine, where he goes and talks to them and they tell him about the naughty gnomes, and or the scene in Bluebells of England where Douglas comes in and talks to Percy for a while, and I see them as having this nice relationship, where they're kind of they're looking out for Percy, because most of the big engines on Sodor aren't. They think of Percy as this little bug that's kind of annoying to them. They care about him deep down, but most of the time they're kind of rude to him. Whereas Donald and Douglas, they care about Percy and they look out for Percy, and they're the types of engines to kind of if they were to go up all the way to Doc's branch line, they would bring him back a souvenir, that sort of thing.
I could see 13 being the railway equivalent of Percy's pen pal. Lives on the other side of the Vickerstown Bridge, just sort of locally in the area, and every once in a while he and Percy meet up.
That's cool, because I could totally see. I like to imagine 13 as one of those 5 engines around the turntable where Percy's telling them his Percy takes the plunge story. Yeah. It's I could because Percy and 13, based on the whole framework we're kind of designing for 13, they have a lot of similarities. Percy was passed around from owner to owner for a long time. Percy is a unique design, a successful design, but a unique design that there's no other examples of. He was cobbled together from a bunch of different parts, and he's had a very colorful history all across Britain, where he's worked in many different places. So I feel like every now and then, it's kind of like being a freelance model maker or something, and you're kind of going through the industry, and you cross paths with the same people quite often, even though you don't work directly with them. It's kind of like that with Percy and 13. Is for years they probably crossed paths. Before the grouping, even, they probably did that. And so they met each other quite a bit, and that's when they first got to know each other. And then eventually you're in the position where now dieselization is starting up, things are modernizing, and Percy, whenever he gets the chance to take a stone train to Barrow, he goes and sees 13 and many other engines, because Percy has, interestingly enough, Percy seems to have more friends on the mainland than anyone else. Even though he doesn't go there often, he spent more time there than a lot of engines. Tells
you a lot about Percy, too, and his ability to make and keep friends. Because I could see the Fat Controller looking, I need another engine to help out in this yard on the Little Western.
And he'd talk to Percy, and Percy would know a guy. Because he's got, just hundreds of friends. He remembers all their names.
He would go to Percy about it. And honestly, this is a little aside. That makes Bluebells of England more heartbreaking.
I know. That's the crushing thing.
That makes it really heartbreaking. Because I think when they have Percy nearly sobbing, and him naively talking about it, I think we don't give Percy enough credit.
Yeah, I think he knows a lot more about dieselization than everyone thinks he does.
He's a lot more emotionally in touch than a lot of other engines.
So think about the engine's histories. Gordon spent all of his time on the mainland at Doncaster with his brothers, and that was it. Then he came to Sodor. He didn't meet anyone else. James spent a lot of time on the mainland, but also it seems like he's tried to leave that past behind him, because that was back when he was painted black and he wasn't a very important engine and all that stuff. Henry, I doubt his experience on the mainland was good. Thomas, was shipped over the same year that he was built. So Sodor's the only world he's ever known.
And he's not even connected to his brothers,
Yeah, exactly.
Toby and Percy are the only ones that have later experience with the mainland.
Percy has spent more time on the mainland than anyone, really. He's made a lot more friends over there, because Percy had to have been built in the early 1900s, right? 1905, around there, maybe. Mm-hmm. But he arrives on Sodor in 1949. That's a lot of time that Percy has not been on Sodor. He's been making friends this whole time, whereas everyone else, mainly their lives have been on Sodor. And so when Percy is now on Sodor, and he's trying his best to keep up with all these friends, and he remembers all their names, and the end, I think Percy would send messages to his friends, and then, one engine would talk to the other, and another would talk to the other, and eventually that message would carry across England. And he'd be able to keep in touch with all of his friends, because even though Percy hasn't seen a lot of them in years, Percy's like a real, like, the only way I can describe it is like a family man, right? Like, that's what he cares about more than anything else.
He doesn't cut ties with anybody.
Exactly.
No matter what. And I think that...
And so even if he met 13 back in 1920, he would still be in contact with him to some extent.
Yeah. And I could imagine, especially if we're talking about, Percy's awareness of the situation on the mainland. I think it's... I honestly think that out of all the engines, second to like Donald Douglas and a few others, Percy is really in tune with what is going on the mainland.
Yeah, and I think he's the fact that he's so crushed about it. It's not because it's a shock to him and it's sudden. It's because he's personally affected.
He has honestly more friendships, more relationships to lose than Gordon.
Yeah, no, a lot more. I mean, because just the time that he spent over there. I mean, Gordon hasn't even met all of the A3s and A1s, and a lot of his pain for losing them is founded in his pride for his class rather than his personal connections with each and every one.
What's funny is Percy probably met more of them than he did.
Yeah, honestly, that's possible. He's at least met a few members of that class that, Because what would end up happening is that, so Percy makes all these connections in his 40 years before he comes to Sodor. Then he lives on Sodor permanently, and he tries to kind of get to Barrow as much as possible and kind of keep up with friends there. He sees 13 there sometimes. And, in 8 Famous Engines, you see him there with 5 black tank engines. Maybe one of them is actually 13. But then slowly that dwindles down to 4.
Yeah.
And then there's only 3. And then there's 2. And
then it's 13.
Yeah. And it's like Percy starts freaking out because he realizes what's going on. And he realizes that they're not coming back.
Especially because those other engines, I was just briefly looking up their classes. They're like 1887 to like 1905. And I could see 13. I could possibly see 13 as being built like between 1905 to like 1910. Maybe he's a little bit newer than them. I don't know.
I think he's older. I think he's like 1890.
It kind of depends on like what basis we kind of want to give him, if one at all.
I don't think one at all. I mean, I can't imagine really anything that he would actually be. Looking at him, he's incredibly unique. There's no way he would be a totally different engine if you were to give him a new basis.
And I like that about him.
And yeah, I think that leads to his unlucky factor too, is the fact that like he's just not he's not a standard design, and so he has a lot of problems that other designs wouldn't because they've been a lot better thought out and worked out. What I love is that I could totally see a situation where Percy's losing friends on the mainland fast. Every time he goes over there with a stone train, he's seeing fewer and fewer tank engines. We're getting into the 60s now, and he's seeing the effects of this. And so that's when he knows he has to go to someone. So he goes to... who does he go to first? Maybe Thomas. Thomas isn't thinking about engines disappearing. He's thinking about the fact that the beaching axe is going to get his branch line cut. So he's freaking out about that. He doesn't have time to deal with this tank engines disappearing thing.
Stressful time to be Percy.
Yeah, so Percy can't go to Thomas, because Thomas is just like, I'm sure they'll be fine. I've got to keep my branch line alive. So Percy can't go to him.
You know what's funny? You know what would be so Percy?
What? So
this is the scene I'm picturing. I'm picturing Percy's, like, for whatever reason at Vickerstown or Barrow, and 13 is there in the yard. I could see him getting picked on by some, like, diesels or whatnot. Percy just wises up to the situation and, gets 13 out of there and just brings him to the Fat Controller.
My God. It's like a little boy bringing home a puppy, and then his dad is like, "You can't bring this puppy home, damn it, we don't have the money to feed it." And Percy's like, "Please, can we?" He's like, "Fine, I'll buy him."
And I think there's precedent for it too, and I think this connects to the point you made, a really great point about 13 being a freelance design, is that Percy would have the awareness, especially knowing that 13 is unlucky, that he has a bad firebox.
Yeah.
Percy would be pretty wise to know that 13 is actually pretty damn lucky to be the last of those, like, 5 or so tank engines.
Yeah.
because he was probably the most feeble out of all of them.
Then really what it is, it feels like I could totally see engines like Gordon and Henry and James saying that he's unlucky just because he's 13, because they don't want to acknowledge that he's unlucky because he's on BR and engines are dying. And a few years later, Gordon would never say that. He would be like, okay, I get it now. It wasn't that he was unlucky. It's that everyone was dying.
Especially by the time Oliver arrives, they would all be eating their words.
Yeah,
they would look at 13 and feel so guilty.
Yeah, because they would try to justify it away. They don't want to believe that steam is dying on the mainland. And so what they end up doing is justifying it away with specific circumstances. Like, oh, he was too old anyway, so it made sense that he was retired. Oh, he's number 13, of course he's unlucky. It doesn't have anything to do with this systemic problem that's getting a lot of engines scrapped. No, there's reasons for all of it. And that's why we can't personally be affected. But they are affected. And eventually it gets to everyone.
And I have to say, there are interesting ways you could take this. One that causes a lot of resentment from Percy, because you could go. I think he would
be the only one who's going to the mainland and understanding that engines are disappearing there, and he'd tell everyone, and no one would listen until a few years later when it was too late. He would be furious. He'd be like, I told you guys, you could have done something, but instead, Gordon and Henry and James were so pompous and thought they would go on forever that now they didn't do anything when they could have. We could have saved engines, but instead, they believed that they were invincible.
Right.
And now it's too late. Now all of Gordon's brothers are gone. Now all of Percy's friends are gone. Everyone is gone, and it's because they wouldn't do anything about it. Percy was the only one who would actually acknowledge the problems on the mainland. No one else would do it. Donald and Douglas, and this is what I think would be really cool, right? So I imagine Percy goes to Thomas, and Thomas is like, I have to focus on the beaching axe right now. I can't think about these tank engines, right? Which, fair enough, right? Thomas's world is collapsing. He may very well lose his branch line. He keeps it, luckily, but he could have lost it easily in that time period. Then Percy, I think it'd be sweet if the next person that Percy goes to is Gordon. Kind of like, he's kind of the, semi-father figure. Like, he goes to Gordon and asks him, because he's thinking big, strong Gordon can fix this. But then Gordon, of course, is like, oh, that tank.
I don't have time for unlucky engines. It might be contagious.
Yeah, exactly. And he's like, Gordon doesn't realize the true magnitude of it. He thinks that Percy's overreacting, because Percy does tend to overreact in a lot of situations. And so he's just thinking, all right, well, nobody's going to die. Everyone's going to be fine. Steam isn't going anywhere, right? That's what Gordon believes. So he doesn't help Percy. Neither do Henry or James. Maybe Henry would, but we'll come back to that. But what I think Percy would end up doing is he would talk to Thomas. That wouldn't work. He would talk to Toby, and maybe Toby would have a panic attack because he's dealt with scrap directly, and so he's like, he can't deal with this.
Toby would be almost ineffective here.
Yeah, he would just...
He'd be getting over the loss of his brother still.
Yeah, so Toby would just kind of be like, Percy would be like, Toby, you have to help me, please. Percy, I know you're going through something difficult right now, but I just can't do it again. And Percy would just back off, and that would be that, right? He would leave him to it. And, and so then I think Percy would go all around the railway. Everyone would have their own things they're dealing with. Everyone would have their own kind of thoughts about how this isn't as big of a deal as Percy's making it out to be. And he finally finds Donald and Douglas. And they treat it seriously immediately. And they're like, well, what are we going to do about it then, Percy? And so the three of them come up with a plan. And I could see Donald and Douglas. What if Donald and Douglas, because I find it odd that they would be struggling this early on. What if they're not struggling? What if they can handle the goods traffic just fine, but they pretend to be really tired so that the Fat Controller will have to bring in another engine? And that's 13, and so there's this big plan where Donald and Douglas are panting and they're really struggling with all this goods work. And then when the Fat Controller's like, what, do you need another engine to help you? Percy swoops in and he's like, I know just the engine, sir. And that's 13. And so they all work together to bring him to the railway. And then Donald and Douglas are kind of like his keepers, because Percy, in this scenario, Percy's almost kind of like a little kid. And meanwhile, Donald and Douglas are kind of, they're in a position where they're 13 and Percy's guardians, where they can kind of prevent something bad from happening to him. Which I think is a really cool turnaround, because Donald and Douglas originally are the vulnerable ones. and now they're embedded in this railway in a situation where they can help other vulnerable engines, which is what Douglas does with Oliver later. But I like the idea of them taking in this 13 engine and kind of doing everything in their power to protect him and make sure that he doesn't get sent away.
And that would be their MO. I mean, they did that to each other. Of course they're gonna extend that to 13.
I love the idea that they would do it for Percy too.
Yeah.
'Cause I just so see Percy coming to Donald and Douglas with tears in his eyes after the big engines turn him down. And they're just like, those heartless bastards. We'll do something about it, Percy. Don't you worry. We'll save you, friend.
Yeah, I could see Bluebells of England being the setup for that. Like after Stepney goes by.
Like it's literally like that's that conversation. Like Percy comes up crying to Douglas, and that literally right after that scene where the story shifts to Stepney. We stay on Douglas and Percy, and they figure out a plan to help 13.
Yeah.
That would be very cool. I just love that Percy is like pretty much the most woke engine on the railway at this point.
Yeah.
It's like I feel like I could totally see his sadness being misinterpreted as like an overreaction, and like everybody just thinks that he's like taking it too seriously, and that.
You know what I like is some added depth to Bluebells of England. This is actually really deeply able to be connected. You know that the famous picture of the scrapyard with those two engines.
Yeah, yeah.
Those those are Percy's friends.
Yeah, exactly. Because these engines on the mainland feel quite. They don't feel like real characters to us. You know, they're kind of a plot device. But it humanizes it a lot for Percy to have friends on the mainland, for him to actually be close with a lot of these engines. And so he keeps up with them and then loses them. I mean, that's a big deal. That's why I really like... It almost sets it up in 8 Famous Engines where you see him talking to 5 engines over on the mainland.
Yeah.
It's like, all 5 of those just cannot survive the rest of the books. Like they'll disappear at some point.
No, yeah, and that's honestly, I'm thinking of, it would gradually set in. Like when it goes from 5 to 4, the 4 probably wouldn't be taking it as seriously as they need to be, and then it gets down 1, and then they're panicking a little bit, and then
it's down to 2, and it's desperate.
Yeah, it's like the 7 stages of grief.
Yeah.
And then by the time it's Percy and 13, I could see it just being this really quiet, sullen moment where Percy's just like, bother,
Yeah, exactly. Where he's they're just defeated. They're not even wailing with sorrow. They're just there, kind of like, damn it, like we lost.
Well, and that begs the question, so let's suss 13 himself out a little bit. The second block that you read about, first let's talk about the landslide. So that's a major moment.
You know what would be cool? I like the idea, just because of how he looks and because of the kind of the association with Donald and Douglas. I like associating 13 with dieselization. What if 13, the reason he's getting into so many accidents on Sodor and he's unlucky is because he's just not trying. Like, think about it. What we've set up for him, he's just lost all of his friends, He's like...
Especially that scene in as all the friends dwindle and it's just him and Percy. I could see... Because here's the thing,
Percy's trying to save 13 and kind of give him a will to live again. And 13 is just kind of giving up on everything, and he's like, look, they're going to scrap me either way, Percy. I'm not going to try, right? And so he's careless, Like, I could even see it where it's like he would rather go out on his own terms, so he throws himself into the landslide.
Yeah, I think this begs bringing up the elephant in the room, and I think this is a perfect segue into this. I think that 13 and Boomer from Tugs are very similar, and yeah. I would apply a lot of Boomer's personality to 13's.
I could just so see 13 being so just beaten down after dieselization and during dieselization, after losing so many friends, and just after feeling like, like what if it's even the fact that, like, Wouldn't it be crushing if it's like his metal quality is so low that the only reason he's survived is because he's not worth anything? Like, he's literally not even...
He's not even worth the price of scrap.
Exactly. And it's like... And so it's like he really just feels like total just garbage. And he just,
Honestly, I keep going back to that scene where it's just him and Percy around the turntable because, I could see 13 saying something like, I was the luckiest engine in Britain.
Yeah, because he's like he had such great friends and he had such an awesome experience and just moving from railway to railway.
It wasn't him being 13 that made him unlucky. It was the circumstances, and everyone is so more willing to blame the victim.
Exactly. Like, I really like the idea that in these really trying times where everybody is terrified of modernization and they really don't want to believe that steam is coming to an end, they are much more willing to blame this engine's number and blame it all on just superstition.
He must have done something to earn this.
Yeah, then look at the root cause, which is just he's not getting into accidents because he's unlucky number 13. He's getting into accidents because he doesn't care anymore, because he's lost everything. And so why is he going to try to avoid a landslide? Why is he going to try to avoid getting into crashes or derailing? He doesn't care. He thinks he's going to be scrapped anyway. And so really the challenge was never trying to save 13 from dieselization. The challenge was trying to save him from himself. The challenge was that Percy is trying to drag him out of this depression and make 13 realize that he can go on and have a good life on Sodor. And he just barely manages to drag him to Sodor and convince him to give this one more shot. And Donald and Douglas, after everything they've been through, everything they've lost...
They see right through it, and they know exactly what to do.
Exactly. They are like the best, kind of mental health help that 13 could get. They, know how to prop him up. They're this great combination of seriousness and understanding of life's darkest sides, and at the same time, they're also very jovial and very positive, and they can really... They can make you smile in just terrible circumstances because they had to do that for each other for years. They had to stay positive when their class was being scrapped and where their world was collapsing around them. All they had was each other. So Donald and Douglas learned how to make each other smile when the world is falling apart around them. So they can do the same thing for 13.
And what sucks is, this also speaks to an underlying sentiment that just is throughout the Northwestern Railway, is that I bet you many of them feel like engines on British railways, steam engines on British railways, some of them almost deserve their lot because they're not trying. Notice how when dieselization happens, the Northwestern Railway, the engines just resign themselves to it. They know they're not going to be affected. They're worried about themselves. They're not worried about the engines on the mainland who are being cut up like Percy is. But that's what makes Oliver's journey to Sodor really so important, because it shatters that sentiment. The engines up until that point believe that the reason that a lot of engines from British Railways were not escaping, that were not being preserved, is because they almost deserved it in a way, because they must have done something or whatnot.
It's so interesting, this overarching theme of everyone's looking for something to blame, something easy and simple to blame that doesn't affect them personally. In this situation, it's 13's number. They're blaming that. When really, it's the greater system that they're living in that's causing just terrible pain for this engine.
They just don't see the bigger picture.
So ultimately what happens is 13 comes to Sodor. Donald and Douglas kind of succeed in lifting him out of his depression. Percy does to an extent as well, but he's still really struggling. And then one day he gets caught in this landslide, and he could have gotten out of the way. He could have just kind of... He kind of just stops on the line, and his driver's like, "What the hell are you doing, 13?"
His side rods just sort of seize.
Yeah.
And he grinds to a halt.
And he just jams up, and his driver's just like, "What? Come on, keep going." And he's just... And he just kind of sits there and just doesn't say much, and is just really has this grim expression.
His fire almost goes out.
Yeah, this landslide just kind of hurtles down the hill, and he gets caught in it. And then Percy hears the news, right? I imagine what would happen is, like, I kind of imagine Thomas during this whole situation as kind of like the really busy older brother working on something important, like he's at work or something, and then Percy comes in crying, and he's like, "Not now, Percy," and Percy's like, "13 is in a landslide," and Thomas is like, "Oh shit, I should have been involved in this," and so then he gets involved.
So I think that there's an interesting crossroads here, because there are a few paths you can go with this. One is, after his repairs, he somehow joins the Northwestern Railway.
I like to believe that's what happens. I think I like to imagine that when the landslide happens, Percy goes there personally with the breakdown train, and it's like he's the one who digs him out really desperately, and he gets him out, and he's like really messed up. His firebox is like across the yard, and so it's like he's in bad shape, right? So they take him to the works, and that's what will be interesting is what would be cool is if in between these two paragraphs that we read on the wiki, if we kind of filled in that gap where it's like 13 goes to the works, but he's going to be there for a while, right? So so Percy takes him to the works. I'm imagining Percy takes him on a flatbed personally to get there, right?
Yeah.
This isn't necessarily a necessary scene, but this is something that would be really cool. What if the landslide happens, like, right outside the Tidmouth Ridge, like, very nearby, like, the big station, and, like, Gordon and Henry come up, and they're all pissed off that 13 is, like, it looks like he's caused this accident with his unluckiness. And so they're like, why the hell did we let this engine on our railway, right? And then, meanwhile, while Percy's digging 13 out, Donald and Douglas come in from either side, and they're just like, "You leave him alone," and they kind of like bar Gordon and Henry's way while Percy gets 13 to the works, and they kind of like put up a mean front, just so that they have a role in that whole thing.
And then they'd see 13 go by, and they'd be like, "Oh God,
I didn't know it was that bad." It's like that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But it's like, I think that So I'm imagining Percy takes 13 to the works after the landslide, right? And he's in just terrible shape in every way. He's physically in bad shape, and he's mentally in bad shape. So he leaves him at the works, and he stays as long as he can, like until like closing hours, right?
Like a hospital ER visit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he's like, and he comes to at some point, and he's just like, "Percy, just stop trying. I'm done," right? And Percy's like, just refuses to accept that, right? He can't, and on some level, I think it's almost a little bit unhealthy, because I think Percy's almost kind of trying to save all of his friends on the mainland by saving 13. It's like, I failed all of them. I can't fail you too. I need to save someone, right? I need to have some agency in this situation. And so he's desperately trying to save 13 as this symbolic gesture for all the engines that were scrapped on the mainland.
And 13 just resents it. He'd rather just go gracefully into that good night, but I'm imagining
maybe Victor is here by this point, maybe he's not, I don't know, but let's just throw him in there, say he arrived in the early 60s. So it's like, say Victor's at the works, right? And he's like, "Percy, can I speak with you in private for a second?" And so they kind of go off into a siding somewhere and speak to each other. And Victor explains that, like, 13's condition is really bad, and it's like he doesn't know if he can fix his firebox. Like, it's really, really bad, right? Like, it's almost impossible to fix. And so he might want to start saying his goodbyes.
Yeah.
And Percy's just in tears, and he's like, Victor says something like, I don't want to tell him that his firebox is just totally destroyed, right? Because, like, I'm imagining it's like 13 is really down and depressed, but he doesn't even understand. Like, if he could look behind himself and look at where his firebox is, it's like it's barely even there.
Mangled, and his cab is gone.
Yeah, like, he doesn't even realize how badly messed up he is. Only Percy and Victor can see that, and they're like, "Geez, he doesn't even know." So Victor's talking to Percy, and he's like, "I have no idea how to break the news to him that his firebox is totally destroyed. He'll lose all hope, all will to live."
He's like, even if we fix him, can we even make him steam?
Yeah, and then Percy's like, "I know exactly the engine who can fix this." And he goes and he talks to Henry, and he asks Henry, you know what it's like to have a really badly messed up firebox. Could you go and talk to him?
I could, yeah. I like this.
And at first, Henry's kind of like, "Oh, I don't know, Percy. I don't know the engine.
It was so many years ago, and I've got a train to pull."
Henry, please! He needs you! And it's like, he's just got these big puppy dog eyes, and Henry looks over, and it's nighttime, right? And Gordon and James are like, they're asleep by now, so it's like they're not gonna judge him for going over there and talking to 13. So Henry's like,
fine.
yeah, and Henry ends up traveling to the works, and he speaks to 13. And this, I think,
and this is like Henry's strengths coming through here because we rarely see them.
Exactly, and it's like I think Henry makes a bigger.
Oh, I don't know. You say this first, but I have a good idea.
Yeah, like Henry and out of all the engines that have tried to help 13 with Percy and Donald and Douglas, Henry helps him more than anyone because Henry knows what it's like to be in that place. Not just, be physically just have all these problems and just be really...
Be on the brink of death.
Yeah. But also, beyond that, he knows how to... When he has just no hope anymore. When he thinks... Yeah. When he thought he was going to be scrapped and he was desperate and sad and he just didn't think it was worth going on. That's really what 13 needs help with. Because the men at Croven's Gate, they can do anything. They're the Croven's Gate workmen. They can fix any engine, right? But they can't fix his soul. And Henry can do that. Henry can tell him...
My idea kind of comes into play here. I could see this scenario being like this, where it's... in Blue Mountain Mystery, where it's just like quiet and there's only a few lights on and Luke is there?
Yeah.
It's like that. Henry's like...
Yeah.
When I had my accident, I wasn't optimistic, but I went to the forest.
Yeah.
I'd sit there for an hour or so and just take it in and have it be quiet.
And at first 13 wouldn't say anything. He would just but he would like look over, which is a lot more than any of the others got him to do, right?
Well, yeah, and then I'm thinking Henry takes 13 to the forest on a flatbed.
That could be cool. I think that's Henry's thing. I think he loves nature. I feel like Henry would be able to figure out what would be good for 13. And so I think, I almost see it a bit like Henry's quite compassionate with 13, but he's also like got a bit of tough love where 13 is just like, there's no point to any of it. Why am I even trying? And Henry's like, because Percy cares, because Donald and Douglas care. Because I've only known you for 5 minutes, but I care too. So you have to keep going no matter how painful it is. And Henry's the only one on Sodor who can say this, because he speaks from experience. He suffered dreadfully for years, and no one cared. Yeah, and so it's like, Henry, and yet he hung on.
I could see him saying, look, I suffered dreadfully and no one cared. So when that happens, the only one who can care is you.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to.
It's so, like, I could just so see him providing this just invaluable insight, because he knows what this feels like. And in a way, Henry opens up more with 13 than he has with anybody else, because 13's the only one who can truly understand what Henry went through. Because all the other engines understand, oh yeah, sure, your firebox had a bunch of problems and all that, right? But they don't get the full extent of the misery Henry went through, and the fact that he was just this white elephant his whole life, that, like, just... Nobody wanted him, and everybody thought that he was just this waste of metal, this horrible design. And what that does to an engine's psyche is just it's irreparable. And so the fact that Henry overcame that he managed to live with his illness for decades, that makes him way stronger than James and Gordon put together. And he may look weak from the outside, but he is tough as nails on the inside. And he would impart some of that onto 13, and then 13 would start to realize, it's like, maybe there is a bit of hope. I mean, it might not be a good life right now, but why throw it away? And Henry's just like, now you're starting to understand. And I'm sure you'll suffer dreadfully for a while, but it turns out all right, in the end.
Someone will care.
Yeah, exactly.
I could see Henry also, having this mentality of, like, rather than getting sad, like, especially after he gets rebuilt, like, rather than getting sad, get mad, get petty, just get a little petty and angry for a little bit and then settle down.
Yeah. And I like also the fact that Henry and Percy have always had this interesting little relationship where it's like, you know, Henry sometimes finds Percy to be annoying, sometimes teases him, but a lot of the time, Henry is like Percy's older brother. It's almost like Gordon's like Percy's dad. Henry's kind of like, in a way, Percy's much older brother that moved out of the house like 5 years before he was born. And then Donald and Douglas are like Percy's fun uncles. You know, and so I think that Percy looks up to Henry, and Percy will go to Henry in desperate times like this. And Henry comes through. And so that's why he goes to him and asks him to help 13. And Henry does. And through this wonderful new support network of Donald and Douglas and Percy and Henry, 13 is able to become a much healthier engine. And then he makes it through this really rough period in the works, and he's rebuilt. And after that happens, the clouds don't totally pass. He's still lost a lot of friends, gone through a lot of trauma. It's going to be a long time until he's totally back to normal. He
can at least be a little happy. He can at least have a little of the good life. And, you know, now he's rather than being in a place where all of his friends are gradually going, he still has that one friend. And then he makes more on the island.
Exactly. You know, he's starting to rebuild, you know, and that's truly beautiful, I think, is the fact that Sodor allows, you know, Sodor may be a bit...
It may be a little out of touch and, like, distant, but it's sometimes a little insensitive, but at the end of the day, when the chips are down, they really come through.
It's a place of new beginnings, and it's a place where an engine can go and rebuild a life. And every engine on Sodor, at some point or another, has kind of had to rebuild their life by coming to Sodor. You know, all the engines had to leave a life behind and start a new one. And Sodor is very good at accommodating different engines, you know. I mean, 13's situation, while similar to a lot of others, is quite unlike, you know, any specific engine story. And yet, you know, there's enough empathy on the island, enough understanding, enough open-mindedness that slowly they can kind of come around and understand how to help him. And they do. And I think that makes it really beautiful.
What livery would you give 13 on the Northwestern?
That's a great question, because it would be kind of...
I'm thinking green.
Yeah, to match Percy and Henry. We have barely any... They're the only two engines with those colors.
Doesn't 13 being green, like, actually...
It fits for some reason.
Fits. Because blue is for Donald and Douglas, I think.
Yeah, the thing is, like, it just 13 green that fits.
13 reminds me of the color green, like 3 does, and I think I blame Henry for that.
Yeah, I know. But I could totally see that, because the thing is, he's painted in like BR lined black or something right now, right? So he's painted in the colors of the railway that destroyed his life and his friends. And so he
would never go back to it.
Yeah, no. It's the same reason why Donald and Douglas would never want to still be black. They arrive in black because that's the colors of BR. And so likewise, you know, they wanted to get rid of those colors. They wanted to start a new beginning, and so they chose the most Sudrian color they could possibly choose, which is the blue. So 13 arrives, and, you know, he ends up...
He ends up going with the sort of auxiliary color that is reserved for characters like Percy and Henry.
Yeah. You know what's interesting about it, too, is I've always kind of viewed Percy and Henry like they've both come from very different eras, but I imagine they both came from the same workshop. Because you notice they both arrived in that green, and no other colors arrived in it, and they're both one-off designs.
And I think that's where, you know, Northwestern green comes from anyway. I think it's they
I don't think there is a Northwestern green. I think that it's literally just these two engines, because Duck and Oliver are Great Western green. I mean, the only two engines that have this color of green with this red lining are Percy and Henry. And I think it makes sense that this would have been the colors of their workshop that they came from at some point. And so this color is kind of associated with odd one-off designs that may not necessarily be efficient.
And it's a deliberate choice for...
I think 13 would probably adopt that, and he would wear that color because it fits him, because he is unusual, and he does have a lot of failures in his design, but he's learning to love that about himself.
Yeah, and it's a very deliberate choice for Henry, too, to go from blue back to green.
Yeah.
He decides that, and Percy, he wants to keep that green, and so 13, I imagine these are his two best friends after this.
Yeah, I imagine.
He would want to do the same.
Well, I wonder where he would work. Would he? I guess he would just be. He would be another utility engine, because if he's filling that kind of niche.
That, but I want him to work close by to the Farquhar branch.
I think. Well, if he's utility, I think he ends up everywhere.
I was just thinking about this, honestly, because I was like, what we don't hear about, like, at all is, like, Sodor's maintenance crew. It's not just the Sodor Railway Repair and the Rescue Center. It's not. It can't be.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there needs to be a dedicated maintenance engine. And I think that 13 fills that gap because... And I could see that fitting his personality. That's his redemption. That's his... he spent all of his time depressed and lonely by losing his friends. But on the Northwestern, working and maintaining the line and whatnot, working just as a maintenance utility engine means that he can spread love and happiness to all the engines in the railway as a whole. He can put himself to a good cause. He
can, and the big thing, I think, is he can make a very tangible difference, and he can be useful. Yeah. He can be clearly, the railway needs him, right? And so I feel like that would make sense for him, is to kind of be this, this maintenance engine. I feel like him, Donald, and Douglas would kind of be the maintenance crew, which is cool, because even though Henry and Percy, I think, are maybe closer to him than Donald and Douglas, Donald and Douglas still play a huge role in his life, because the three of them are the maintenance engines together. So I feel like I love this circle of characters, because it's so unusual. Donald, Douglas, Percy, and Henry. But I can just so see this making sense as a coherent story.
Yeah. Also, to tie up some loose ends, it says here on the wiki that 13 returned to the mainland a very lucky engine. No. And it is unknown what happened to him afterwards.
I imagine he stays on Sodor. That just seems a lot more fitting to me. But yeah, so I think we've weaved a pretty great narrative for 13. I really like what we came up with.
Absolutely. And as always, I'm thinking about making a 13 custom now.
God damn it, Matt.
This is really...
This one, I think, has been one of the saddest.
Yeah.
Maybe not, I don't know, maybe we've gotten sadder than this. But it's like, this is definitely... Like, 13's life just gets really miserable here. And I know we talk about dieselization a lot, but that's because it's like talking about history and not talking about World War II. Like, that is a huge event in history. It always comes up. It affected everything when it happened. And dieselization spanned from the late 50s to the late 60s. That's a lot of the core chunk of all the Thomas stories take place during that. So it's kind of hard not to talk about it. And when you see an engine like 13 that is a spare engine, in air quotes,
right,
from the mainland, who Donald and Douglas think would be the end of him if he's sent away, and he's painted in BR lined black, I can't help but think that he has ties to dieselization. And so I think that makes a lot of sense for his story.
I think one interesting tidbit to end on is, I think it's fascinating that throughout all this, we didn't mention diesels like once. We hardly ever did. We didn't mention a single diesel relative to 13.
Yeah, and that's really because he's not looking for blame. He's just looking at the system itself, and he understands, yeah, British Railways is doing this. They're the ones who decided to do this to me. It's not the diesel's fault. And I think partly that's probably because, everyone blames his situation on his number. And so he assumes, he's not going to do the same thing with the diesels. He's not going to say they're the problem. He understands they're just a symptom.
I think the fact that 13 is isolated from direct conflict with diesels in ways that Donald Douglas and Oliver were.
Well, think about where he's working. He's working in Barrow-in-Furness,
I think,
which is the place where all the failure diesels get sent.
Right.
So he's not surrounded by pompous diesels that think that he's a failure, that he's not getting any of that, right? He just hears from the top down that British Railways doesn't value him, and that's what crushes him.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because later on, as time passes, I'm sure he becomes a more valuable asset to, reaching out a hand of amnesty towards diesels, because You know,
Yeah.
I think of Sydney and Norman, you know, some problematic Diesels, Dennis. They come to the island and he could vouch for them.
Yeah, and 13 knows, he knows when somebody is pinning a very large problem on a very small cause. He can see that very easily. He knows what it's like to be mischaracterized because somebody isn't willing to see the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And so when somebody says, oh, the Diesels are to blame for this very large injustice, he knows that that's ridiculous. That's BS. Like, no, it's a lot more complicated than that. It always is. Just like you can't pin him being unlucky on his number. Really, the truth is he's not any less lucky than anybody else. It's just that everyone has an excuse to say he's unlucky, so they do. If he didn't have the number, then they would have to come up with some other excuse. He can tell when someone's being scapegoated, because his number gets scapegoated all the time as the source of all his problems.
And I love that 13 never feels compelled to change it.
Well, it's because all along 13 knows that his number is not the problem. And he tries to tell people, but they don't listen. But, you know, he knows that he's not unlucky. He's probably not even superstitious at all. It's everyone else around him is superstitious.
No, and everyone else invents it and
Exactly.
and puts it on him. Yeah, I think that's a really valuable irony that we got out of this. And overall, I think 13, you know, with the discussion that we brought to him, can easily be one of my favorite characters.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, no, I
it's
definitely...
crazy how character gallery works like that. Like, we do an episode on a character, and I fixate on them for like 3 weeks. And they become my favorite character for that time period.
Yeah, well, that's the fun part, is like highlighting a specific character and just kind of finding out what's great about them. And I think we've definitely done that with him.
Absolutely.
So anyway, I think we've said our piece on 13, so I think we can close out. I've been Master of the Lemons, a.k.a. Lemmy.
And I'm here, the Japanese Train, a.k.a. Matt.
And thanks for watching, everyone.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys in the next one.